When Michael left Julia for a younger woman, he thought he had won. He had the perfect life, free from responsibility, drowning in luxury. But fate never forgets, and payback always comes in ways we least expect. 5 years later, Michael found himself at an elite business event, toasting to yet another success, until his gaze landed on a woman who looked eerily familiar. His chest tightened, his breath hitched. It was Julia, but not the heartbroken woman he left behind. She was more powerful than he ever was, commanding attention, surrounded by billionaires. And then, the bombshell dropped. She was now the CEO of a company that could either make or break his empire. How did Julia go from being abandoned to being the woman who now controlled his fate? And what chilling truth was about to be revealed? Keep watching, because what happens next will leave you speechless. Welcome to a world of untold stories and shocking truths. Some secrets change lives forever, and this one just might. Let's begin. Michael Dawson had it all, or at least that's what the world believed. A thriving real estate empire, a mansion overlooking the city skyline, and the kind of wealth most people could only dream of. His days were filled with business deals, lavish parties, and a life free from anything that felt like responsibility. 5 years ago, he had made a decision that, at the time, felt like a victory, leaving his wife Julia for a younger woman named Veronica. Julia had been a good wife, no doubt, supportive, patient, and always standing by his side. But over time, Michael started to feel like he was missing out on something more exciting. He convinced himself that Julia had become too predictable, too ordinary. And when Veronica, a stunning 20-something model with an intoxicating laugh, came into the picture, temptation won. "I deserve more," Michael had told himself when he packed his bags and walked out of their home, leaving Julia with nothing but a few parting words and a signature on their divorce papers. Julia had begged him to reconsider. She wasn't angry. She wasn't screaming. She was just broken. "Michael, we built this life together. Doesn't that mean anything to you?" she had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. But Michael had already made up his mind. "She's younger, Julia. She makes me feel alive. I don't want to be stuck in the same routine for the rest of my life." And with that he left. For the first few years, life with Veronica was exactly as he had imagined. Thrilling, extravagant, new. They traveled the world, attended exclusive events, and indulged in luxuries most people never even knew existed. But then something changed. Veronica wasn't as charming when she wasn't getting exactly what she wanted. She demanded more money, more gifts, more attention. The young, carefree woman he had fallen for had turned into someone who saw him as nothing more than a bank account. And Michael, for all his success, was getting older. The same insecurity that had made him leave Julia now haunted him. Was he enough? One night, Veronica stormed into their penthouse, holding her phone in the air. "You're boring, Michael. All you care about is your stupid business. I'm not going to waste my best years waiting for you to retire," she spat. And just like that, she was gone. Michael should have been angry. He should have felt betrayed. But the truth was, he didn't care. Veronica had left, just as easily as she had arrived. And now, for the first time in 5 years, Michael found himself truly alone. He sat in his massive, empty penthouse, looking out over the city, the empire he built, the life he chose. So why did it feel so hollow? That was the moment a strange feeling settled in his chest. Regret. He hadn't thought about Julia in years, but that night, her face came rushing back. The way she had looked at him when he left, the quiet devastation in her eyes. Whatever happened to her? But before he could dwell on it, his phone buzzed with an invitation, an exclusive charity gala, hosted by one of the city's most powerful CEOs. A distraction. Exactly what he needed. He had no idea that this event would change everything. Michael arrived at the gala dressed in a sharp-tailored suit, the kind that radiated wealth and power. The event was held at one of the most prestigious venues in the city, a towering hotel with gold-trimmed chandeliers, live classical music, and an elite guest list that included politicians, business tycoons, and celebrities. The moment he stepped inside, he was greeted with the usual nods of respect. Michael Dawson, the real estate mogul, the man who made millions, was still someone people wanted to impress. He moved through the crowd, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, but his mind was elsewhere. The truth was, he wasn't here to socialize. He was here because he didn't want to sit alone in his empty penthouse, drowning in thoughts he couldn't shake. Then the room shifted. It started with murmurs, small hushed whispers among the guests. He noticed people turning, their eyes widening, expressions changing from admiration to something else, something closer to awe. Michael followed their gaze, and when he saw her, his entire body tensed. Standing at the center of the room was Julia. But this wasn't the Julia he remembered. The woman before him was different. She wasn't the heartbroken, abandoned wife he had left behind. She was confident, radiant, and commanding attention. Dressed in an elegant black evening gown, she held herself with the kind of power that couldn't be ignored. And she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by the wealthiest, most influential people in the city. People who just minutes ago had been fawning over him but were now orbiting her. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he noticed the man standing beside Julia, a sharply dressed billionaire whose name he recognized immediately. Ethan Blackwell. Blackwell was one of the most powerful real estate investors in the country. Ruthless, brilliant, and nearly impossible to impress. He didn't waste his time with just anyone. Yet, here he was, leaning toward Julia, speaking to her with the kind of respect Michael had never seen him give to anyone. Michael's mind raced. What the hell was happening? Julia wasn't just attending this gala, she was the center of it. A waiter passed by and Michael grabbed a champagne flute, his fingers tightening around the glass. He needed to understand. He needed to know what had changed. Before he could think, her eyes met his. For the first time in 5 years, Michael was face to face with Julia, and she smiled. Not a smile of surprise, not a smile of nostalgia. A knowing smile, like she had expected this moment, like she was waiting for it. Michael's chest tightened. Something was very, very wrong. Julia wasn't just back, she was powerful, and he had no idea how. Michael stood frozen, the sounds of the gala fading into a distant hum. Julia was smiling at him, not with anger, not with sadness, but with confidence. The kind of confidence that came from knowing something he didn't. For the first time in years, Michael felt small. His heart pounded as he forced himself to move through the crowd, his feet heavy like lead. He needed answers. How had Julia ended? Up here with these people? With Ethan Blackwell of all people? He was only a few feet away when a woman's voice interrupted his thoughts. Michael Dawson. It's been a while. He turned sharply and came face to face with Victoria Langley, a well-known business journalist. She held a champagne flute in one hand and a knowing smirk on her lips. Michael forced a polite smile. Victoria, it's been a long time. She took a slow sip of her drink before glancing across the room at Julia. She looks incredible, doesn't she? Victoria mused, her voice laced with amusement. Michael's jaw tightened. What do you know? Victoria let out a soft chuckle. Oh, Michael. Don't tell me you came here without knowing. She leaned in slightly. She's the woman of the hour tonight. Michael frowned. What are you talking about? Victoria's eyes gleamed with delight. She loved being the bearer of shocking news. Julia West, the woman you walked away from, is now one of the most powerful investors in the city. She's built an empire, Michael. She owns half the luxury properties in this room. Michael's stomach dropped. No, that couldn't be possible. Victoria continued, clearly enjoying his reaction. She started small, bought a few properties, flipped them, reinvested. And now? Now she's a partner in Blackwell and Associates. Michael's head snapped toward Julia, who was still speaking with Ethan Blackwell. A partner? In one of the most ruthless, high-stakes real estate firms in the country. It didn't make sense. When he left Julia, she had been devastated. She didn't have the resources to climb her way up like this. How had she done it? And why had he never heard about it until now? His grip tightened around his champagne glass. She was nothing. When I left, he muttered, almost to himself. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Nothing? She let out a laugh. You really don't get it, do you? Julia wasn't nothing, Michael. She was just waiting for the right moment. Michael barely heard the rest of Victoria's words. His mind was racing. His ex-wife, the woman he had cast aside like she was irrelevant, was now one of the most influential players in his own industry, and she had done it without him. His pulse hammered in his ears as he made his way toward her, pushing past guests, his ego demanding answers. Then, as if sensing him approach, Julia turned. Their eyes locked once more, but this time she spoke. "Michael." Her voice was calm, unbothered. She was in control now. He swallowed hard. "Julia, we need to talk." A flicker of amusement crossed her face. "Do we?" His fists clenched at his sides. "Yes." Julia studied him for a moment. Then, with an air of absolute power, she gestured toward the exit. "Fine, but let's make this quick." Michael followed her out of the grand ballroom, his chest tight. He had come here tonight thinking he was still at the top of his game, but now he wasn't so sure anymore. The moment they stepped outside the ballroom, the energy between them shifted. The distant hum of conversation and laughter faded as Julia turned to face him, her posture poised, her expression unreadable. Michael took a breath, steadying himself. He had faced billionaires, cutthroat investors, and high-stakes negotiations, but nothing had ever made him feel as unprepared as standing in front of the woman he had left behind. "You wanted to talk," Julia said, crossing her arms. "I'm listening." Michael studied her, trying to find a trace of the woman he once knew. But this Julia, she wasn't waiting for him to explain himself. She wasn't looking for closure. She was in control. "Now, I didn't know you were back in the city," he started, his voice level, calculated. Julia smirked. "I never left." That caught him off guard. "What?" She tilted her head slightly. "You assumed I disappeared, didn't you?" "That I crumbled after you left." She let out a soft chuckle. "That's the problem with men like you, Michael. You think you're the sun and that everyone else just revolves around you." Michael clenched his jaw. "I never said that." "No," Julia agreed, "but you believed it." Her words stung, but Michael wasn't about to let her take control. "To have the conversation." He squared his shoulders. "You built all of this in just 5 years?" His tone was edged with skepticism. Julia gave a small, knowing smile. "You'd be surprised what a woman can do when she's forced to start over." Michael ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "So what happened, Julia? You were devastated when I left. How did you go from that to—" He gestured, vaguely toward the ballroom, where some of the most powerful people in the city were still vying for her attention. Julia exhaled, as if she had been expecting this question. "I was devastated, Michael. For a while I felt like my world had ended, but then something changed." She stepped closer, and for the first time he saw the steel behind her eyes. "I realized you did me a favor," Michael scoffed. "A favor?" "Yes," she said, simply. "Because for the first time in my life I had no one to rely on, no one to hold me back. And instead of wallowing in heartbreak, I put my energy into something else, building my own empire." Michael stared at her. "But you had no experience in business, no capital." Julia raised an eyebrow. "And yet, here we are." Michael swallowed hard. She wasn't telling him everything. "So let me guess," he said, crossing his arms. "You met Ethan Blackwell, and he took pity on you." For the first time that evening, Julia's expression darkened. "Careful, Michael," she said quietly. "I built this on my own. Ethan came later, when I no longer needed anyone's help." Michael opened his mouth to speak, but Julia wasn't finished. "You see, while you were busy spending money on a woman who left you the second things got inconvenient, I was learning. I studied the market. I took risks. I made investments. Smart ones." She took a step closer, her voice steady, sharp. "And now the same industry that you thought belonged to you? It belongs to me, too." Michael's chest tightened. Julia had risen from the ashes of their failed marriage, and instead, though of just surviving, she had surpassed him. She let the silence settle between them before adding, "The irony? Some of the properties in your portfolio? You don't even realize it, but I own stakes in them." Michael felt like the ground beneath him had shifted. He wasn't just facing his past, He was facing his biggest competition. His pulse quickened, but he forced a smirk. "So this is revenge, then? You came back just to prove a point?" Julia shook her head, almost pitying. "No, Michael, I moved on a long time ago." She turned slightly, glancing back at the ballroom. "You just happened to step into my world tonight." Michael had spent years believing he had won, believing he had upgraded. But tonight, for the first time, he realized the truth. He hadn't left Julia behind. She had left him behind. And the worst part? She was thriving without him. Michael stood motionless, staring at Julia as the weight of her words settled in. The woman he had left behind, the woman he had dismissed as nothing more than a remnant of his past, had become something far greater than he ever imagined. And now? She was his competition. His throat felt dry. He had built his career by predicting market shifts, by knowing who held the power before anyone else did. Yet somehow Julia had blindsided him. He forced a smirk, trying to regain control of the conversation. "So what now? Are you planning to take me down?" Julia tilted her head, amused. "Michael, you're flattering yourself. I don't need to take you down." She paused, letting the words sink in. "You're already falling, you just don't see it yet." Michael stiffened. What the hell does that mean? Julia let out a small sigh, as if deciding whether or not to indulge him. Then, after a moment, she reached into her clutch, pulled out her phone, and tapped the screen a few times. "I wasn't going to say anything," she said, handing him the device. "But since you asked, take a look." Michael's eyes narrowed as he grabbed the phone, his gaze landing on the screen. It was a news article, and the headline sent a jolt of panic through his chest. "Dawson Real Estate faces financial trouble amid market uncertainty." His stomach twisted. He quickly skimmed the article, his heart pounding. It questioned his company's stability, speculated on whether his recent deals were as strong as they appeared. Michael clenched his jaw. "This is nonsense." Julia raised an eyebrow. "Is it?" He shot her a glare. "I've handled market fluctuations before. This is just noise." Julia gave a small, knowing smile. "Maybe, but investors are fickle, Michael. And perception? It's everything." Michael swallowed hard. She was right. It wasn't just about numbers. It was about confidence. If the industry believed his company was in trouble, people would pull out, deals would slow down, clients would hesitate. And Julia. She was standing here, watching it happen. His grip tightened on her phone. "Did you have something to do with this?" Julia laughed. "I don't have to manipulate the market, Michael. The numbers speak for themselves." He handed her phone back, tension coiling in his chest. "So what? You came here to rub this in my face?" She tucked the device away and shook her head. "No, Michael, I came here to do business." She glanced back toward the ballroom, where Ethan Blackwell was speaking with several high-profile investors. That's when it hit him. Michael had assumed Julia's presence was some kind of coincidence. But it wasn't. "You're here for Blackwell," he said slowly, realization dawning. Julia smiled. Smart as ever. Michael's mind raced. Blackwell and Associates was a powerhouse in real estate. If Julia had secured a partnership with them, it meant she was now operating on a level far beyond his reach. He exhaled sharply. "So what now?" Julia gave him a long, measured look. Then, with the same calm confidence that had unnerved him all night, she said, "Now, I win." Michael's stomach dropped. He had spent years chasing success, believing he had left Julia behind in his shadow. But standing here now, he realized he was the one being left behind. Julia had rebuilt herself, stronger than before. And now? She was miles ahead of him. For the first time in his life, Michael Dawson wasn't the one in control, and that terrified him. Michael's pulse pounded in his ears as Julia's words echoed in his mind. "Now, I win." It was a statement, not a challenge. A declaration of power. For years he had convinced himself that leaving Julia was the right move, that he had traded in a stagnant life for something bigger, something better. But now, standing here, the reality crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He wasn't the one standing at the top anymore. She was. Still, Michael wasn't a man who backed down easily. He straightened his shoulders, masking his unease with a smirk. "Winning is subjective, Julia," he said coolly. "You might have built something impressive, but success isn't just about money. Let's not forget I was the one who walked away." Julia's expression didn't waver. If anything, her amusement grew. "Ah, yes. You left me for a younger woman, didn't you?" She tilted her head. "Tell me, Michael, how did that work out for you?" Michael's smirk faltered. Julia took a slow step forward, her presence suffocating in the best way possible. "Let me guess," she continued, her voice smooth. "At first she made you feel like a king. She worshipped you, made you believe you were untouchable. But then she got bored, didn't she?" Michael's jaw tightened. Julia chuckled. "And when she realized your money and power weren't enough to keep her interested, she left. Just like you left me." His fingers curled into fists. "This isn't about my personal life, Julia." "Oh, but it is," she countered, "because for years you thought you had won, that leaving me was an upgrade. But now," she smiled, "now, you're realizing you were the one who got left behind." Michael's chest constricted. He had spent the last 5 years chasing a version of success that felt hollow, surrounding himself with people who only cared about his status, and here Julia was, standing tall, powerful, and respected, not because of someone else's money or influence, but because she built it herself. For the first time, he was the one looking up. But the worst part? He couldn't do a damn thing about it. He forced a chuckle, though it felt weak. "So what's your next move, Julia? Are you here to gloat, to make me beg?" Julia shook her head, laughing softly. "Michael, I stopped thinking about you a long time ago. This isn't about revenge, it's about growth." She took one last glance toward the ballroom. "Ethan Blackwell and I have some things to discuss. Unlike you, he values strong partnerships." Michael swallowed hard. He had spent years believing he was the smartest person in the room, but now he wasn't even in the room anymore. Julia turned back to him, her eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, complete indifference. "Goodbye, Michael," she said simply. "Enjoy the rest of your evening." And with that she walked away. No hesitation, no second glance. Michael remained frozen in place, his world tilting. He had spent so long thinking he had left Julia behind. But now he understood. Julia hadn't. Just moved on. She had outgrown him, and there was nothing he could do to change that. Michael watched as Julia disappeared back into the ballroom, her head held high, surrounded by people who once would have been his allies, people who now looked at her with admiration, respect, and power. A bitter taste settled in his mouth. He had always believed that he was the one who made the right choices, the one who knew how to build success. But tonight shattered every illusion he had clung to. His fingers tightened around the rim of his champagne glass, but he didn't drink. The celebration felt empty now. The luxurious setting, the laughter, the music. It all seemed distant, as if he were no longer part of it, because in a way, he wasn't. Michael had spent years chasing distractions, throwing himself into high-end, living fleeting relationships and business deals that, at the time, had seemed groundbreaking. But standing here now, looking out at a room that no longer revolved around him, a painful thought crept into his mind. Had he wasted his time? He had left Julia because he wanted more, because he thought she was holding him back. But what if she had been the only thing keeping him grounded? What if, instead of outgrowing her, he had simply lost sight of what truly mattered? A cold breeze from the open balcony doors sent a chill down his spine. He turned and stepped outside, desperate for air, for a moment to think. The city stretched. Before him, the skyline glittering with 1,000 lights, his empire, his kingdom. Yet for the first time, it didn't feel like enough. The door creaked open behind him, and Michael didn't have to turn to know who it was. Ethan Blackwell. Of course, the man who now stood beside Julia, the man who had given her a place in the world Michael once dominated. Ethan walked up beside him, pulling out a cigar, lighting it with a slow, practiced motion. He took a drag before speaking. "You know," Ethan mused, "I've met a lot of men like you, Michael." Michael tensed. "Is that so?" Ethan exhaled a puff of smoke, nodding. "Men who think power is permanent. That just because they've built something, it'll always be theirs. He turned to face Michael fully. But power shifts, and those who don't evolve, they get left behind. Michael clenched his jaw. You think I've been left behind? Ethan smirked. I don't think it, Michael, I know it. Michael's chest burned. He wanted to fight back, to argue, to remind Ethan that he was still Michael Dawson, a man who had built an empire from nothing. But the truth was staring him in the face. Julia had stepped into his world and made it her own, and Ethan Blackwell. He had given her the final push to surpass Michael entirely. Ethan took another drag of his cigar, glancing back at the ballroom. She's smart, you know, Julia, sharp, focused. She sees opportunities most people don't. Michael swallowed hard. I know. Ethan nodded. I figured you did. But the difference between you and me, Michael? His smirk widened. I saw her worth before it was too late. The words landed like a gut punch. Before it was too late, Ethan let the silence stretch before chuckling. Enjoy the party, Dawson. And with that, he walked back inside, leaving Michael alone with his thoughts. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. On instinct, he almost typed Julia's name into his contacts. But then he stopped. What would he even say? Would he apologize? Tell her he was proud of her? Try to mend what had been broken? He knew the answer before he could even entertain the thought. Julia didn't need him anymore, and that was the most painful truth of all. Michael exhaled, slipping his phone back into his pocket. For the first time in his life, he felt small, because tonight he hadn't just lost to a competitor. He had lost to the best version of the woman he never should have left. Michael lingered on the balcony, long after Ethan had left, staring at the city that once felt like his playground, but now seemed like a kingdom slipping through his fingers. The wind carried distant laughter from the ballroom, a reminder that life moved on, with or without him. He had spent years believing he was unstoppable, that his decisions had been the right ones. But tonight had shattered that illusion. Julia had thrived. Without him, his company was weaker than he thought, and the people he once commanded no longer looked to him as the leader. For the first time, Michael wondered if he had been fooling himself. All along, the thought made his chest tighten. Just as he turned to leave the balcony, a familiar voice stopped him. "You're still here?" Michael froze. He knew that voice. Slowly, he turned to find Julia standing in the doorway. She wasn't smug, she wasn't gloating. She just looked at him with the kind of quiet certainty that told him she had moved on long ago. Michael swallowed. "I needed some air." Julia nodded, stepping onto the balcony beside him. "I get that." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't tense, but it was heavy. Michael finally exhaled, forcing himself to say what had been on his mind all night. "You did well, Julia." His voice was quiet, sincere. She turned to him, arching an eyebrow. "Are you surprised?" Michael let out a breathy laugh, shaking his head. "No, not anymore." Julia smiled faintly. "Good." Another pause. Then Michael did something he never thought he would. He admitted the truth. "I was wrong," he said, his voice lower now. "About everything." Julia studied him, tilting her head slightly. "I know." That simple response nearly knocked the wind out of him. She didn't need an explanation. She didn't need an apology, because she had already moved past him. Michael turned back to the city, gripping the railing. "I thought I knew what I wanted," he muttered. "But maybe I was just chasing something that never really mattered." Julia let out a soft sigh, glancing back at the ballroom. "People do that sometimes. They think happiness is somewhere else, somewhere new." She looked at him again, her gaze steady. "But the truth is, happiness isn't about chasing. It's about building." Michael swallowed the lump in his throat. Because in the end, that was the difference between them. He had spent his life chasing. Julia had spent hers building, and that was why she had won. He turned to her one last time. "I hope you keep winning, Julia." Julia smiled, but it wasn't a smile of victory. It was a smile of peace. "I already have," she said simply. With that, she turned and walked back inside, disappearing into the world she had created for herself, a world Michael would never be part of again. As he watched her go, Michael finally accepted the truth. Julia wasn't his loss. He was hers, and nothing would ever change that. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button. To show your support, it truly helps me bring more impactful stories to you. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on more emotional, thought-provoking tales. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and share. What part of the story touched you most, or how it made you feel? Your feedback means the world and shapes the future of the channel. Thank you for being part of this community.